Welcome to the FretDojo podcast, the place where pro guitar players share their secrets. Visit www.FretDojo.com to access online courses and free resources to take your guitar playing to the next level.
Hello and welcome to the FretDojo podcast. My name's Greg O'Rourke.
And I'm Vin Amorando.
And we're the instructors at FretDojo. And today we have a very special guest, the fabulous Beth Marlis. Welcome to the show, Beth.
Welcome, Beth.
Hey,
Excited
thank you,
to have you.
guys. Oh, me too. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Excited.
Fantastic. Now, so I just thought we'd kick off today by filling our audience in as to Beth's accomplishments over her career. So Beth holds a bachelor's degree in music from UC Santa Cruz and a master's degree in music from the University of Southern California in studio and jazz guitar performance. Beth was also an honors graduate of the Musicians Institute Guitar Program, GIT, in 1986. Beth's co-authored two massively successful instructional books and DVDs, Guitar Soloing and Advanced Guitar Soloing, published by Hal Leonard and M.I Press, and has held numerous masterclasses and workshops across the US and Japan, most recently at the California Jazz Guitar Conservatory in Berkeley, California. Beth's performed and toured the US, Europe, and Canada with a wide range of artists, including Harold Land, Brownie McGee, Helen Reddy, Louis Belson, and many others. And Beth's also composed over a dozen film scores. That's quite interesting. And Beth's taught thousands of guitar students as an M.I instructor since 1987, specializing in jazz and funk. And she became Vice President of the Musicians Institute in 2010. So Beth's also heavily involved in nonprofits and is the executive director of the Musicians Foundation, which provides educational opportunities for contemporary music students. So in addition, she maintains an active schedule as an LA freelance guitarist. So welcome, Beth. Fantastic to have you on the show. But firstly, I want to take a bit of a tangent. I want to talk about Aikido. So, given that we're enough of all this jazz guitar stuff for a moment, because we saw in your bio that you're given that this is a FretDojo, you know, this kind of Japanese themed set that we have going on here, thought that would be a nice talking point. So, you have an interest in Aikido, I believe.
Oh, enough of this jazz guitar stuff, right? I love how we start this podcast. We're done with that. Great question, and I will do my best to answer it, but I will go back and roll the tape back, not that it's terribly important, but I've actually been teaching at GIT since 1987, not 97, so what's 10 years, or jazz guitar between friends, doesn't really matter. So we'll talk about Aikido. Which I love. I do have a great interest in that. And of course, the word dojo is very near and dear to my heart. So I almost want to interview you to ask you why you made the choice, but I can understand why, because it really, any kind of dojo is going to be about serious practice and, transformation and, implies a lot of, kind of major pursuits, for lack of a better word. It's a serious thing. So for me, my Aikido career actually started back in the 70s. When I was in college. So I studied it and practiced it and taught for about 15 years. And for me, the reason that I don't still practice it is that I had a little injury at one point, and I couldn't reconcile that with being able to play the guitar, and without getting too into the weeds with it. I actually had an injury that was right here, which is the spot on my shoulder where your guitar strap hangs. Oh. And I sort of had to face this choice of, am I going to be doing martial arts or be a musician? And so I decided to choose that I should be a musician. And I retired from teaching. Maybe it was even 20 years that I practiced, I don't know, but it's not really the number that counts as much as the impact on my philosophy and DNA, and about arduous practice, about staying focused, about centering, about all kinds of aspects that come from many of the martial arts that are really a great complement to being a musician, apart from injuring your shoulder, which is not complementary. So much of the practice of martial arts, breathing, awareness of time and space and fluidity are very much, about harmony. And so I don't need to make that connection any more obvious. It's very much a part of my music, even though I don't, put on a black belt or anything anymore and go to the dojo. It's still in me. And so I know there's some, other music and jazz guitar sites and teachers that you term, and it actually always, makes me feel kind of pleased, for lack of a better word. It's like, that's great because you get it. And over the years, I've met a lot of people who were karate students or taekwondo or tai chi or whatever it is, who are also musicians. And, every single time, we see eye to eye on how it really is one of the best compliments to being a guitar player and being a musician, possible. So yeah, I'm happy to be here in the dojo again.
That's
But
fantastic.
yeah, that's a great question. But I don't know, maybe we'll talk about guitar too, if you
Yeah,
like.
yeah, I think we should. Yeah, I really resonate with what you were saying though. I found I sort of chose this kind of line for the branding because I found for me jazz guitar was a real path of challenge and mastery. Jazz is almost like a martial art in a way. I know it doesn't look like it on the surface, but in terms of the study you need, the dedication, the mindfulness, really the way you can really make fantastic improvised music in the moment is really bringing your mind to that single point of focus. Like where you're not sort of worried about what the audience is thinking, or you're not worried about the mistakes you made in the past or whatever. But that's really where the magic happens in jazz. So it's a bit of a reminder for me, I guess.
Good. Well, thank you for reminding me. Makes for better podcasts too. But it is, you're absolutely right. It's consistency. It's climbing the mountain, even if it's one, tiny grain of sand per day of working, to evolve, being willing, I think of this in music all the time, being willing to take risks and to be present and not carry baggage, and
Mm.
that's a very natural thing, I think, as musicians, that's something that we can talk about maybe at a later point, about things that hang you up, that get in the way, that I think have that same sort of single-mindedness that you talk about. So it's a real advantage, I think, that it came from that. As a teacher, it helped me to be a better guitar teacher as well, because I taught martial arts, and so somehow that really, I feel, I can't quantify it really, but I do feel like it made me a much better teacher as well, which was interesting, over the period of time that I did both. And sometimes I was doing both at the same time. So it felt very fluid, the way that I would approach it. And I think I had a reputation in my early GIT teaching years of being a really hard teacher. And
Like
really,
you brought the bamboo stick out, was it?
something like that, that I was very tough and that I was really demanding of my students. And, I could say I'm considerably so much, easier and nicer. And not that I was really, tough without reason, but I think I did come into it in my early days of teaching because of teaching martial arts, that it really, the expectation level was really high, in a certain sort of way. So that's an interesting evolution too. But yeah, it's definitely, no one, I don't think, of all the interviews I've ever done, no one's ever asked me about Aikido, much less the first thing. So kudos to you, Greg. And thanks for reading
No
my
worries.
bio. So appreciate that. That's great.
All right. Well, okay. Well, enough of Aikido martial arts, but stay tuned, guys, because Beth's going to be really sharing some key insights into how to improve your jazz guitar playing when we get into the meat of the interview a bit later on. So, but let's get started though with your journey with music and jazz guitar. Why did you pick up jazz guitar? Where did it all start for you, and how did things evolve from there?
Um, as a kid, I think in my generation, a lot of kids could point to the Beatles, and I was one of those kids for sure. So I started out musically around 5 or 6 years old playing violin, and it just seems so horribly uncool to be a violin player that by the time I was 10, I was begging my mom particularly, get me a guitar, please, you got to get me a guitar. And it worked, and I got a guitar and I got lessons, and I hated the lessons so much. I really hated them, and I was a, like rebel kid immediately because and in those days, Jimi Hendrix was kind of appearing, and there was things going on. It was like, not what I wanted to learn from my teacher. I didn't want to learn America the Beautiful and folk songs, and she made me sing. So I took my very first guitar, and it has no connection to Aikido or anything like that. So don't infer any wild theories about it. I took my first guitar and I smashed it against the side of the house. I smashed it. So I guess I had a thing for like, I don't know, weaponry or whatever. But maybe it was a Jimi Hendrix moment. And I just thought, I hate this. I'm not going to do it. And I want to be cool. I want to play the guitar. And that was my motivating factor. But luckily for me, down the line, a few maybe months or a year later or something, I got another guitar. I got an electric guitar that was a hand-me-down from a relative, a Hagstrom electric with 85 buttons on it. And I was just thrilled. I got a little amp, and I had a little band with my neighborhood kids, and we were hippies, and we had a good time. We played rock and roll, and I learned all kinds of Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and all that stuff, and would bring my guitar to school like in 8th grade, 9th grade, as I was a little older, every single day. I was one of those kids. I mean, I couldn't stop, playing it. So it would come with me to school. Anyhow, that's where it started. And eventually, and not soon enough, I went off to college. And, by the time I went to college, I had already been turned on to Pat Martino and George Benson and Jim Hall, even like in high school. I was sort of, again, a rebel. All my friends loved rock, and I started listening to jazz, and I had friends that played jazz, and got a degree in music. I went to college, and it was sort of a jazz degree, which in those days, believe it or not, there were no grades where I went to school. There were no, really not even really clear majors in a way. So my music degree was in Latin jazz, Indonesian gamelan, and electronic music. So it
Wow.
was pretty eclectic and unique. So that was an interesting musical upbringing. Very, I got to perform with John Cage at one point even. Very different than your average, kid that goes to music college. So it was a little unusual. I got to do some touring. I did an album in the 80s, played bluegrass and jazz, new acoustic music, which was great, had, huge audiences I was playing for, and had this moment where I was on stage in front of, I don't know if I get this, my memory a little fuzzy on this, if it was 10,000 or 30,000 people, I don't know, in the audience, an enormous, enormous festival. And I had this realization once the set was over and it was a success and it was great. But I thought, you know what? I don't even know all the notes on the fretboard. I don't even know what I'm doing. I know my parts. And we got standing ovations. Like, I nailed it. The band nailed it. And I knew my parts. And I thought, I got to fix this immediately. And all the eclecticism was cool, the gamelan and whatever. But the reality is that I needed to go to that school GIT in LA and fix it. So I did. And then I never left. So
Wow. Wow.
so I went there in 1985, and they hired me as an instructor fairly soon after I graduated, which I felt amazed that, I was able to be hired, and I made the promise to myself it would only be a year. I'll just do this for a year because I want to be a session player. I want to tour. I don't want to be like teaching. I don't want to do that. But 36 years later, I'm still there. And that year,
That's a very long
it's been
year.
it's been a really good year. It's been a great year. And, I do think, there is that little thread of Aikido again, because I think through Aikido, I learned that I love to teach. And through, that background, which I had before I started teaching at GIT, I realized I love to teach. in spite of my ambitions to be a jazz star or a session musician or whatever. I really loved to do it. So, pardon me. So that just continued to expand. And, in 36 years, you can imagine the trouble I got myself into running programs and writing curriculum and wearing a lot of hats and nonprofit hats, like you mentioned, and so on and so forth. And all along the way, I kept playing as a kind of a, I'll call it mercenary. That's not a very polite word, I suppose. But,
Mercenary.
I was a side man. I would just do whatever. I could play. I like to think I could play any style. I would do country gigs, I do rock gigs, I do jazz gigs, and I was a good reader, so I could play. I did a lot of like awards shows, things like in the pit orchestra, so I could just play, and I attribute that ability to read, of course, to going to GIT, and that time going to that school was certainly amazing as a student because I was surrounded by Joe Pass and Joe DiOrio and fusion guys, like of course Scott Henderson and Larry Carlton and Pat Martino, and they'd all come around, and it was just an incredible foundation. The thing I'd been missing in my life before was like there it was, and I was just in this center of the guitar universe, or it seemed to me that way, and that's a big part of why I never wanted to leave. It's like, why would you leave that? It was
What an
great. So
amazing experience.
that was very, very, very special. And in my time running the department, I became the department chair of GIT. Again, one of those situations where it's like, I couldn't believe they said, yes, we'd like you to do it. But I really had this imprint as a student of how every day was amazing. The candy store was off the hook, so to speak. So when I ran the department, I tried to replicate that experience too. So I would bring in every imaginable visiting artist and clinician and concerts and seminars and just create this environment that nobody, could make. Like the recipe, it just didn't exist anywhere else in the world. So I was very lucky during that period of time to be able to be in the center of that and be surrounded by the very best, the very best. So I think that shaped me in ways that I can't even begin to talk about on a podcast. But very lucky. That's my very long answer to your very short question about how did you come up. That's really the thing that made me. And my musical mentor number one during that time was Joe DiOrio. He really was sort of my musical father. I'll just tie this up by saying my education didn't end with being at GIT. I also, as you've mentioned, got a master's degree at USC, and I continued studying to this day. Of course, it's the we're always student mentality that's really important to me. So that's my foundational training came from there, and then other things we can talk about as far as the people who tried to emulate or who I've studied, on my own since then, since I had that blueprint from GIT. West Coast is very different than East Coast. There may be somebody who came up through Berkeley, similarly to me coming up through GIT and MI. But even geographically, it's a very different world and the kinds of players that are in New York or Boston versus LA. So, I also sort of really see myself as, a West Coast guitar player for whatever that's worth. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm
Oh
one
no,
of
I
them.
get
It's
what you're
interesting,
saying. Yeah, yeah. I've got a question for you, Beth. Just in that time where you were sort of right, like a kid in the candy store, these amazing players surrounding you at GIT. What were some of the biggest takeaways that you got from your conversations with them, or playing with them, or like what were some of these sort of key points that you have really impacted your playing and study of jazz, having hung around these guys?
There's a very almost nuts and bolts thing that every GIT student learns when you're there, and two things. One is how to practice, and Howard Roberts, being the founder of GIT, he was such a a tremendous studio musician and quick study, and always advocated getting things off the page. So when you would go to school, since he founded the school, based on his many years of seminars before he actually founded the official school GIT in 1977, his teaching method, one of them was time frames, that when you practice, it's really important that you break information into small digestible bits of maybe no more than 10 minutes. So that was a new one on me. When I went to school, we had timers. When you practice 10 minutes, timer goes off, you stop, dead stop, and then you take a 1-minute break. And the science, or I should say maybe the experience based on having done this, I think, from Howard and then all the students and faculty for years afterwards, is that you really are at your top functionality in that 10-minute time frame. Anything as, the human brain and systems, go on more than 10 minutes, it's just like you start to decay. Your ability to retain information and focus goes down after 10 minutes. So that was a very different and interesting way of approaching, putting more and more material into a shorter and shorter time frame. Of course, as you get to be a better player, you do it naturally. Playing a, harmonic minor scale might have in the beginning taken you 20 minutes to figure out how to do it. And now you can just do it in 5 seconds. Similarly, obviously, as you get more information and more skilled, not only physically, but also mentally, you can accomplish more in a shorter period of time. And that really is something Howard Roberts attributed, as a part of his success, other than the fact that he was incredibly talented and a lot of other things. But that was a very different thing, unique to GIT, I think, maybe, so that was a worthwhile thing. Now, I don't still do that. I'm going to be the first to fess up. But I do try to, from time to time, I do try to make myself adhere to some version of that, of when I notice, that I start to kind of slightly drift, to be kind of assiduous with myself about it. You were saying, sorry.
Yeah, it's just no, it's interesting you mentioned that. I remember several years ago I did a course that impacted me quite a lot. I think it's still a free course. It's called Learning How to Learn. It's an online one on Coursera, and they were talking about short-term memory versus long-term memory in that course. And they likened short-term memory to like a kind of like a blackboard that's not a very good one, and it's only got limited spots. It's only got like these 4 little panels on it. And so if you overload that short-term memory, you don't get any advantage. You actually need time to allow that short-term memory, that information you're presenting, to filter through to your long-term memory, that's where the real retention happens. But if you never give yourself a break like that, and that's such a simple idea, but such a powerful one, it's actually leveraging the way the mind naturally works when it's attempting to acquire and assimilate information.
I mean, I think that's very interesting. And I think as musicians, we want to operate at our peak performance level, of course, because what we're asking ourselves to do specifically, and particularly in jazz, is very high level, and maybe that sort of behavior, to take something from short-term to long-term memory. Another thing that I remember as sort of a saying at the school in the early days was 21 to 30 days, 21 to 30 days. That's how long it takes for you to be able to ingrain, a new lick or a piece of information so that it goes into your long-term memory and it's available for you to pull out, as needed. And flies in the face with so many aspects of what, we encounter when people are trying to learn now, with the overload of information, of more is better, of the FOMO, of like, I've got to be this sort of hoarder of information, when in reality, it probably really, it's like having a lot of tools and no blueprint. It's like, it's not going to help you to keep acquiring. At a certain point, you realize that you have to really kind of cut the distractions away, and that focus we talked about in terms of martial arts and how to memorize or how to learn or how to ingrain. There is really something to it, and maybe the recipe is different for different people, So for me, I can't see myself with the egg timer and 10 minutes, or my iPhone and putting it on 10 minutes and making myself stop. But but I do think that is a part of, my practicing, the way that I go about taking in information and teaching it to a certain extent, and putting, you know, different topics in manageable boxes, as it were, rather than overwhelming. Like throwing, if I'm a teacher, my job is not to throw information at someone endlessly, because teaching, like this podcast, is, it's conversational, clearly, and it has ebbs and flows, and there's natural spaces where you can just take in what someone just said to you. I mean, someone, the old cliche of someone that never stops talking. I mean, you just tune it out. And I think we do that unwittingly to ourselves as musicians when we get addicted to information gathering, and I confess to having out of frame here on my desk a pile of books, that
Don't
I
we
never
all?
touch.
We all do.
I mean, I'm not talking about novels, obviously. I'm talking about music books and instructional books, and they're full of wisdom and brilliant. But music isn't learned necessarily through them. Of course, it's through the recordings. It's through music. It's through playing with other people. It's language. It's vocabulary. All of the metaphors that your other guests have used, I'm sure, about how to acquire language and how to speak. It's the cliche of, there's poetry, there's dance, there's art, there's music, there's theater, sonnets about falling in love, to use the most ridiculous metaphor. But you don't know what love is if you don't do it, if you
Exactly.
don't experience it. It's experiential. And the same thing with music. It is absolutely an experiential, conversational, language. And so books are great, and can help. But I think the forest for the trees, a lot of people confuse getting online information, internet information, books, this and that, and all the tools they can possibly stuff in their pocket, and then they're a little lost. And what happens here in this podcast and in other communities is great, because I think it helps to steer people back to the the, how should I say, being receptive to other people's ideas, and not being kind of locked into accumulation of knowledge. You have to put it to the test. You have to play music with other people. You have to not just be in a singular conversation with yourself. So you have to connect. There's a really strong need for being able to be a part of a community, and to have conversations, and to not just only hear yourself because you're home practicing in your bedroom. So that was a very long answer, but anyway,
No,
back to GIT. What did I learn?
No,
What did I
just
take
before
away?
we move on, there was some amazing points covered there, because that whole thing about information, it's a unique thing of this age, isn't it? Because we're in the information explosion stage. Like there's billions of extra hours uploaded to YouTube every day of some, and I'm sure there's amazing information out there, but that's the problem, isn't it? Information doesn't actually, but in and of itself, you actually need the actual structure around the information for it to make sense. Like if you just sort of try one thing over here, one thing over here, you need someone like yourself, Beth, to tie it all together, so that you know what the pathway is, the sequence, rather than the actual just the sort of the whole spread of information. But let's talk about that. Like when you're teaching, what's some of the core elements you find are really important to cover in terms of the bases covered when you're teaching jazz? Do you spend a lot of time on improvising, or on singing, or on rhythm training? Like what's some of those core elements that you tend to focus on?
I think that's a great question, and thanks for underlining the value of having a good teacher. By the way, I'll talk about what I do. I do think having a good teacher, it's really important, so that they sort of set you up on the raft, with you need, and then they kind of push you out so you swim, and then you enter into the world of what excites you, and what the sounds, and the players that you love, and the phrases and the ideas and the music that you love. That's what a good teacher does, and they help you identify what that is. What draws you to the music? That's the most essential basic thing, is why are you doing this? And therefore, you know, knowing that you have a passion or something that draws you in, something that makes it worth it to do the work in order to become free enough to actually play, and put in the time, and, you know, be honest with yourself and be willing to grow. You got to find, like, why do I love this? So I think in the very beginning with students, I want to know, like, what's their motivation, you know, who motivates them, and then uh, what kind of commitment are you willing to make? And that should ideally change the longer you play. You know, are you practicing an hour every day? Are you practicing more? Are you practicing every other day, or whatever? A lot of these factors determine outcome, obviously, and the kind of student you are. And what are the essential things? Number one is to figure out a practice schedule. That's actually the first thing I ask a student on the very first day, although I don't really teach private lessons anymore. But I used to always ask, like, essentially, how much skin in the game do you have? How much time are you going to put into this? Especially if they're a GIT student, well, that should be, the answer should be, you know, hours and hours and hours. But we're all unique, and, you know, whatever your commitments in life and time are unique to you. But that's a question you never stop asking from day one. What am I going to practice? So I think putting a structure in place, like, how many days am I going to practice, how many hours, so forth, I think it's very important. So then you're not always asking yourself or feeling guilty about it. Like, oh, I didn't practice. Just make an agreement with yourself, I'm doing this much. And then you can change it later. But that's a very simple sort of, you know, if you're an athlete, you know what your training schedule is. So that's a very simple thing. I think that it's important also to cover, obviously, fretboard knowledge, just basics, like, you know, my upbringing at GIT was the caged system, so 5 patterns, so that you would learn 5 patterns of everything. So all scales, all arpeggios, all chord voicings, all sequences. You'd learn 5 patterns of everything all over the neck, and you'd learn everything in one place. So it's the vertical and the horizontal that you need to know that. You need to know one thing everywhere, and you need to know everything in one place, very simply said. But that doesn't take 5 minutes. It takes a while, you know, for a student to, maybe that's the ticket, the key to the door of being an intermediate player, I suppose. It's like, once you know that, you never stop working on it. You never stop getting better at it and knowing it deeper. Like, if you're playing an arpeggio, do you know all the notes in it as you're playing? Do you know that's a C sharp? You know, can you multitask? Can you, you know, this is a simple way to practice, but can you double and triple your money? I mean, like, if you're playing an arpeggio, can you actually sing the note and actually say C sharp, you know, and actually, you know, say it and sing it and know it in your fingers? And can you, you know, layer things so that you're actually able to multitask and learn faster, you know? But that these are just kind of like skeletal, you know, pieces of information that you need to do the work. That's pretty simple. So that's a basic. The other basic thing then, not that it's sequential at the same time, ideally, is you want to be learning ideas. I alluded to it before, ideas that you love, copy phrases that you love, copy sounds that you love, even if it's just a certain chord voicing. It's like, what makes you want to have it? You know, I have a lot of things where it's like, I hear, it's like, I got to have that. You know, as a student, you should hopefully have things that you hear, that you listen, that you do listening, you do actually listen. A lot of students don't actually listen to things. And then you don't have to sit down and transcribe it on the spot, but either try to learn it by ear, or, you know, try to transcribe it or write it, or find a transcription and read it. I had mentioned before, I'm a big reader. I love to read. I really do. One of my favorite, speaking of the internet, websites is SoundSlice. I, every day, as a part of my practice, go on there and sight read for at least 5 to 10 minutes every day. And I'm getting like Hank Mobley, or I'm getting Sonny Stitt or Sonny Rollins, or I'm getting all this stuff, and I'm just able to read it. And it's like, it goes in, you know, so I'm putting ideas and phrases that I love into my playing. And that's one way, certainly, to do it for me, that's very seamless. So you mentioned singing, I mentioned singing. I think singing away from your instrument is important. How many sax players do you know that are just away from their horn? Why aren't we doing that as guitar players, or if we're stuck in traffic? Why aren't we singing solos? It's just these sort of artificial barriers that are, just knock them over. I remember in my going back to the nostalgic, GIT conversation, Joe Pass saying, learn melodies. You want to learn how to play jazz guitar, learn melodies. They're perfect. They're perfect. They're perfect solos. Melodies are like an improvised solo, polished up to a fine shine. And I think that there was a lot, that's absolutely right about that. Is learn songs. But even if you only learn 4 bars, what is it that makes that melody, strong? What is it about it? So I think that that's a really important part of it too. Basics. I'm a huge fan of taking chords, like just a singular chord, and it comes from my studies with Jimmy Weibel, who's a big influence for me, and breaking it into pieces. It's not like a single, what do they call them? Like Jimmy Bruno would say, a grip or whatever, like this thing. It's meant to be not just arpeggiated like a finger stylus, but like take 2 notes out of it at a time, deconstruct it. What's inside of it? There's so much music inside of just even one chord. It continues to, like blow open my mind, particularly the counterpoint, because I've been studying a lot of that the last few years, is contrapuntal, 2 lines going at once, and how they live within chords that we just play that are, fairly simple in a way. In other words, there's a lot in there, even when you're learning at a fairly basic or intermediate level, instead of just playing it. It's like, you have permission. Take your hammer and break it into pieces and see what you can get out of it, because that's where the good stuff is, I think. Certainly, the basics are the basics, and they can't really be argued with. You can't lie to yourself. You have to be honest, and you have to go back. What you talked about, or what you asked about, Greg, about what's the important stuff, is it's the important stuff for everyone. These things, basic rhythm exercises, basic reading, basic theory, ear training, all of these things that are building blocks, but they do you no good if you're not willing to be objective with yourself and call your own bluff. And I'm always going back and fixing stuff. I've been playing more than 50 years, which is quite a thing to say. And I'm still like, oh, the way I picked that's ridiculous. Why have I been picking something, the wrong way for 10 years? It's not really wrong, but why was I doing it? Just because it was a habit, or other things in my playing that I'm always going back to recalibrate it and fix it. I'll just give you my last confession, since I'm confessing all kinds of things about what I do and don't do. Is for probably 20 years I didn't practice. I taught.
Interesting.
Boy, hard to put this on, in a recording somewhere, but it's true. I taught and I did gigs. And so if I practiced, it was for the gig. Talk about a pitfall. I'm a pro. I mentioned being a mercenary sideman. It's like, I don't need to practice, and I don't need to ever rehearse. I just show up to I was like off the charts, like irredeemable almost about it. And because, I teach, well, I'll work on the stuff I'm going to teach for tomorrow and the gig I'm playing tonight. But, I didn't have time. That was my excuse. And I run a program and I'm doing this and I don't have time. Boy, if I had had those 20 years back, if I was doing then what I do now, I mean, granted, I put in about 4 hours a day. I shed about 3 to 4 hours, minimum 3 every day. I love every day I learn something new. That's the opposite of what I did for 20 years. I mean, I was learning this stuff for the gig, but what a waste. So kids, learn from me. Don't do what I did. Even if you're a professional, don't do it.
It's so interesting you say that. I remember I studied with this amazing player, Don Andrews, when I was very young. I used to go to the conservatorium on the Central Coast, and and study with Don. We used to play in a group together. He was a fantastic jazz player. And when he pulled out and was playing his jazz lines or whatever at a concert, it was so impressive. But I remember often walking past his office, just when he was like by himself in there. I didn't interrupt. And do you know what he was doing? He was like doing the C major scale, duh, 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 like the really basic things. But then he'd come out and play these amazing lines. So that there's an example of the fundamentals are important no matter what stage you are. It's to keep things in shape. But that's it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I know, Vin, you've been very quiet and patient. I'm sure
Well, I
you're
am soaking
aching
in
to.
all this wisdom. I'm happy to stay quiet with all this coming in, but
I'll let you ask some questions soon, Vin. But I just got one more that I want to ask on this point, because you mentioned one of the pitfalls. But given that you've taught so many thousands of students over the years, Beth, something that comes to mind for me to ask you is, what, on the flip side, we've talked about what people need to focus on in their practice sessions and in their playing. But what's some of the biggest mistakes where you sort of see these students come in and you go, oh, they're doing that mistake again, and you just keep seeing these mistakes people are making over and over, either in their practice session or in their mindset or approach. Could you share about your observations there? What are the biggest mistakes you see?
I think there's probably like the top four. Number one, don't practice non-musical exercises. And I say that just like the kids don't do what I do, because I used to do that. Like my first touch on the guitar in the morning used to be chromatic exercises. And that's good. That's good if you're watching TV or something or looking at your computer. But don't waste too much time with that. Work on musical ideas. That's number one. Number two is sort of that hoarder syndrome thing, collecting information for its own sake. Like, oh, did you see that thing that, Jonathan Kreisberg played it? Oh, Peter Bernstein, and and then you get nothing done. I think the third one is judging yourself. That's a big mistake. Worrying about, are you good enough? Music is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to bring happiness and joy. And it's really a waste of time to not have that feeling about it. Stop beating yourself up. But it's also a huge mistake to do that to our fellow players, our community. What a mistake. What a waste of time that is. I mean, really, am I good enough? Are you good enough? Nobody cares, really, at the end of the day. So I think that's a big pitfall. And then the other thing, the fourth one is don't practice what you're already good at. I mean, keep it polished up. Yes, there are pieces I play every single day, like some, again, Jimmy Weibel, because it's really challenging and I love it. I'll play these pieces every single day, no matter what. Just like I'll do my scales and arpeggios and my warm-ups and all that stuff, and sequences and the licks that I'm learning. And I do them every single day because I want to get smoother and better at it. Pardon me. But if you're doing that to the extent that you're not growing, it's kind of like that, I'm a pro, I only work on the stuff for the gig. If you're only doing the things that you're good at, you got a problem as far as I'm concerned. And also, it means you're not being challenged. Because if you go out on a gig, or if you go to a jam session, or you just play with your buddy and they kick your butt, thankfully, hopefully, you play with people that are better than you know what to work on. It's instant real world feedback, and great. I love it, even though it hurts sometimes. I love knowing what I have to fix. It's like that pointed it out to me right then and there. So I think if you only practice what you're good at, it's that thing I alluded to before about being honest with yourself. What a mistake. Don't just go like, ding. Oh, that note always comes out badly. Oh, who cares? I'll skip it. I'll just keep going. No, you need to fix that. And it's pretty plain as day. And so that's a huge mistake. You give yourself a pass, whether it's a note or it's the fact that you can't play at a certain tempo or a certain progression or whatever. There's 10,000 things. And the truth of it is, on the flip side, be kind to yourself, because you're not going to learn everything. That's not going to happen. And it's perfectly fine. You don't have to learn it all. But that's what I see anyways, what the four big time wasters are. I'm sure that there's more. I don't know. but those are the four I know.
I find, given this sort of online teaching role that I've got now, I've had to record myself an awful lot, and that keeps you very honest, because I think sometimes we sort of think something's going really well, but then you look back on it, and you know what? Like, there's a lot of things that maybe I was ignoring or not even sort of worrying about that are actually a bit of an issue there. So I find that that's a nice mirror to put to yourself often, recording yourself, listening back. Sometimes listening back right after the session, can give you an interesting perception. So maybe give it a few days, listen back again, and that can really give you some clear pointers on where to improve, I find.
I think it's doesn't lie, and it is. I like what you just said about just giving it a little buffer, because if I listen back to a recording right away, I'm already judging. It's like I have that thing, we're human, and if I do wait a day or so, I'm often surprised, and it's like, oh, that's better than I thought. I mean, so yeah. I think it is a piece of it that's important too, is you should record yourself as well. And, we should throw that on the pile as far as playing with people that are better than you, finding ways to challenge yourself and being honest. Of course, recording yourself is great that way. Vin, you are being quiet.
Well, I'm happy.
It's your turn, Vin. Over to you. You got some questions for Beth?
Well, I just wanted to correct you both, because I've heard Beth say that she's taught thousands of students, and Greg repeated that. I'm going to say that number is much, much higher. Greg, I don't know if I told you, but her books were some of the foundational books that I was using, back when I was just learning how to play. So that number is well into the tens, and if not hundreds of thousands. All my friends had the books, so they were that important.
Wow. That's
so
amazing.
that's your impact is certainly more than just the ones that were in the room with you teaching. Just want to touch, now being a female in a very heavily male dominated space, I was reading, there was a Guitar Girl magazine interview you did. I don't remember how long ago it was, but you said that there's only been a few female guitar instructors. I know it was you, Jennifer Batten, and it hasn't really changed much, in the time that you've been there. Is that still true? And why do you think that is? Like, why is it such a female or such a male dominated thing, and maybe like female teachers are slow to come into the space? Of course, Cheryl Bailey and Kim Perlak at Berkeley and Sharon Isbin are, heads at Juilliard and Berkeley. But is that changing, do you think? Are you seeing more female students in the guitar program? And if not, what can be done to make that happen?
Number one, let's make that happen.
Okay.
So yeah, okay. So we can agree. And you mentioned about the women that are leading these programs, and I think a couple of years ago I wrote an article and did several interviews about that very topic, which I found to be hugely encouraging and enlightening, that elite guitar programs in the United States, several of them are being run by women, which is fantastic, and that's a huge sea change that never happened in history before. As far as going through the faculty levels and the student levels, I think there are probably at Berkeley, there's more women teaching guitar there than there used to be. I think I can say that with some small authority. Not so at GIT, and I can't obviously talk about any other institutions or around the world or in the United States whether there's more women enrolled or not. I can only tell you what I know firsthand here in LA. But yeah, it's been fairly static. It's stayed about the same percentage female students, and guitar's a disreputable instrument. I think you can both agree. And women don't want anything to do with it. No, I really I have found myself being very inspired by some absolutely mind-blowing female guitar players that are out there playing, and doing gigs, and they're really just just, inspiring is the word that just keeps, percolating for me. Really great players that are making a name for themselves. As far as academia, maybe they're out there doing the gigs. They're doing that, and maybe as far as becoming teachers, it's not being channeled that way. I can't address with the students, why it hasn't been a huge groundswell, except to say that maybe online learning, maybe other forms of learning have actually increased the number of women who are excelling at guitar, but it's not a measurable statistical piece of data that we can point at. In traditional brick and mortar higher education, maybe that for whatever reason, it just sort of stays at the level it stays at. I've been mystified. When I was a department chair, I thought I was going to be throwing open the doors, like, follow me. I can do it. You can too. And I think there has been some of that, but I think it's a very multi-layered answer to a big question, and one I'm invested in. I don't, to be quite blunt with you, actually, Vin, I don't spend much time at all thinking about being a female guitar player versus just being a guitar player. And I know that's a fairly obvious thing to say, but it's true. I have much more important things to do. And there's a lot of conversation about this topic, and it has been for a long time, and I've had lots and lots of opportunities to talk about it. But at the end of the day, I can only, as a good teacher or member of the music community, I can really only lead by example. I really feel like that's where the most power is, and hopefully support dialogues, people that do want to talk about it, that I can share whatever I can, with my experience, and continue to see things move forward generationally. But, I don't know the answer for why it isn't moving faster. I really want it to move faster. I want to personify excellence. I want to personify diligence. I want to personify possibility, for men and women, male and female. I want everyone to see, like, look, you can do this, and that it's not, my message isn't really tailored for any one person. But ultimately, I feel encouraged. I like seeing that there's just so many players that incredible, and maybe more in fusion than straight ahead jazz, but I could name names, and or you can find them for yourself online. And I'm meeting young women, particularly. I mean, I won't name any names, but there's a young female student, that came out of M.I that is a fantastic jazz player. That's like maybe going to be an amazing world-class jazz player. It's encouraging to me. So maybe it's quality, not quantity. Hard to say, but I'd like, my last closing thought on this, and I've said this a few times, is that I think if we had just 100, or maybe it'll be 500 great female jazz guitar players on the face of planet Earth, we'd instantaneously have world peace. It would just like all happen because they're walking the earth. So it's a big deal, but I really do want to see it happen. And, it's a big question. So thanks for asking that one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Totally. It's well, you're really holding the beacon for female guitarists worldwide there, Beth. So a big call to arms for all you women guitar players out there. Time to put yourself out there, and it's very inspirational.
Something a little bit lighter here. I noticed on your Facebook page that you had just recently had a chance to play Barney Kessel's ES350. Can you tell us how that came about?
That was an amazing experience. I don't know if you're familiar with Bruce Foreman, fantastic jazz guitar player here on the West Coast. Yeah, great player. He is really the keeper of Barney's guitar. And, he had played with Barney for a number of years, and is an extraordinary purveyor of all things Barney. He can really play that style, and he recorded that fantastic album, The Pole Winners, that was based on the Barney Kessel trio, Poll winner albums and has done a lot to carry the torch to really revive Barney and his playing. And he's using Barney's original guitar that was on so many important recordings. So what's fantastic about Bruce Foreman and that guitar is it's not something that's under glass. I mean, he's taking it out and playing it in every context and every gig, which I think is pretty extraordinary, because when you have that sort of historic instrument, most people would put it in the case and like keep it at home and don't let it out. But yeah, he came over. We just did some playing that day a few days ago, and I got a chance to finally play it, and which was really special. Just the mojo of it. And Bruce is kind of on a mission to put everybody's DNA into the guitar possible. He's making a soup. So it's like everybody's stuff and their licks and I'm putting notes in there and DNA. And but I love that openness, that he's willing to do it, because there are guitars out there like, I know where Joe Pass's guitar is, and I know where Joe DiOrio's, guitar is. And right now, they generally are not really accessible to anyone. This is something that's super cool that Bruce is doing, and there may be more in the future of that. With that sort of thing, I hope, where actually historic instruments get out, and tell their stories, and have people, who can play them and tell the stories, and they can be part of the world again, as opposed to in someone's collection. So yeah, that was a great experience. I mean, the guitar was really interesting, and it was, of course, full of cracks. It was all cracked all over, and had repairs that made kind of near the jack very heavy. I guess they'd put some kind of pegs, or I'm not even sure what, maybe chunks of metal. I don't know what they put in there. The thing's very bottom heavy. The neck felt great, and the guitar played great. Played easier than most of the guitars I play every day. I was surprised. I expected it to be kind of like a baseball bat, but it played great. And just, as a guitar player, to be able to just hold it in your lap, like, that's enough. So he should just take it on a petting tour. Like, everybody could just maybe there's
funny.
money in that. I don't know, but yeah, that was a really special, very good experience. So thanks for asking that.
I just had a quick idea on that. You could almost do a concert, kind of like, it's almost like the guitar's telling its story, where you play classic tunes by Barney Kessel on the guitar, and you might have people that have played with Barney give stories and stuff like that. It could be a really interesting concert, that one.
You should check out. I mean, Bruce is kind of doing that. Actually,
okay.
It's that good of an idea, and because he already released this album, The Poll Winners, with what I didn't really fully fill in is that the other players on that album, Ray Brown, and I'm having a Jazzheimer's moment. I can't remember the drummer on it now. I've forgotten. Was it Shelly Mann? I'm not sure. I think so. Forgive me if I'm wrong. Those three instruments, the drums, the upright bass, and Barney's guitar, all exist, and they were kept by the families, the bass and the drums, so that they were summoned. Those instruments were brought out of retirement, and were played. All three instruments from the original Poll Winners album were played on the new Poll Winners Barney Kessel album. So they were played again, which is super cool. And then
Wow.
Bruce went out on tour and played these things, these tunes, and told Barney stories. And he's done this with something called the red guitar as well, that he uses the guitar as sort of this metaphorical living being, like the red violin, if you saw that film. That had stories to tell, because if you get right down to it, really, I think our instruments do hold stories. We put them in there, we're playing them all the time, but certain special instruments obviously have lived history that is unique. And I think there's something very compelling about what you mentioned, Greg, and finding these other instruments out there and having people share it. And since we're talking about the world itself becoming more aware of jazz and educated, what a great way to be an ambassador. Like, if our government sent cultural ambassadors out, like a Barney Kessel sort of cultural tour to really make it real. If you've ever been in Italy, for example, I think in Florence, I'm not sure if it's the Uffizi Museum, but there's paintings of very, very beautiful Renaissance instruments in the museum. And the way the display, the exhibition is that the actual instruments are right there too, with the painting of the people playing them, with the real
nice.
instruments. It's kind of stupefying
Yeah,
when
it's
you realize you're
powerful.
looking at
It's powerful.
400, 500-year-old instrument, and then there's the picture of the person painted playing it. That's a sort of different variation on the same idea, but it really is impactful. So but again, just being able to have it not be rarefied and in a museum, like I'm talking about, but to have the instrument, here in my lap, amazing. And I know John Paisano, who's in the West Coast too, used to do that with Joe Pass's guitar. He used to invite students over to his house, come and play Joe Pass's guitar. I mean, what a cool thing. So I would love, more of that. And, maybe as our elder statesmen and women of jazz, reach the point in life where they're not able to play anymore, that they'll consider doing that with their instruments, actually putting them into the domain where they can be shared. I mean, that's an interesting, very almost radical idea for some people who probably would just, give it to their children or sell it or whatever. But I think, like Vin, you asked about that. Wouldn't you be excited to play that guitar, like play Barney's guitar or play
Absolutely.
Wes's guitar or Joe's?
Oh,
I
that'd be
mean,
amazing.
who wouldn't? I mean, I think it's just a holy grail sort of. Yeah, let's do it. So it's a cool thing. Yeah, it was a great day.
I've got one more question for you, Beth. In terms of the future of jazz in general, or jazz guitar specifically, where do you see the style going from here? Obviously it underwent a big metamorphosis since its jazz began, but where do you see the future of jazz and its audience?
Oh, that's easy. Yeah, I think that it's a very much it's a moving target. Of course, there's so many pieces in flux as far as the way jazz education and guitar education has changed. And I mean, I'm alluding to online learning to a large extent, like what's happening all over the planet, and diversification of knowledge that didn't reach areas where it had not before. I certainly have a lot of friends now that I didn't have 3 or 4 years ago because of social media and being online, that are all over the world, that are just getting turned on to Hank Mobley or uh, Wes or Grant Green, or that they're, to them it's new, like in other parts of the world, the globalization factor, which I find super exciting. The world itself is going through what the world's going through, so nobody can point a finger at that equation. But I think that a net positive is that there is a tremendous wealth of information reaching people that it never really reached before. And I find it encouraging, and it's our job to communicate that history and the lineage, as I had mentioned before about it, jazz, the tradition being, a language, being a vocabulary, being oral, being in the records, being this historic lineage that needs to have preservation. It needs to have people that are champions, that are teachers, that are taking it around the world, that there is cultural diplomacy that way, that there is internet diplomacy, for lack of a better word. I think I made that up, and it's not even, that's an
I like
oxymoron.
it.
That doesn't exist. I don't think it really exists, but I think that, maybe there's some answer, that is positive, that larger community grows even larger, because we're really lucky. I mean, we get to listen to the music we love, we get to play it, we get to learn it and develop our own voices, and in our microcosmic way, we're certainly part of something much bigger, and it's important, and the world needs us. It's like every day I get to play the guitar, I feel really privileged, I'm really lucky, and I want to share that opportunity and that experience with more people. And so that's where I sort of see the salvation now, or the future. I don't know what people will do with it. It's interesting. I've had a chance to study a bit with some very innovative jazz guitar players who are very outside the regular run-of-the-mill, straight-ahead types. And I'm learning things that's like, oh, I didn't know that was possible, you know? And so if I'm learning that there's new opportunities and ways to evolve the instrument just for myself as a player, I'm fascinated. It's like, what's somebody on the other side of the planet, you know, gonna do with it that maybe doesn't have the infrastructure that I had, you know, or you know, the influences are different. So that's my thought. That's sort of where I see it's an optimistic thing. I'm not negative about it all. You know, I constantly see young people who are excited and are digging in. So I feel very encouraged. Yeah, I think it's not a dark thing at all. Um, I don't know. How do you feel about it? You encouraged?
Yeah, I'm definitely. I think it's a bit like, the medicine or science. It seems like things are almost accelerating in those fields because of the potential for cross collaboration and information sharing. As you're saying, across the world, it's much easier for people to access information. I remember when I was a kid, there was that I had my teacher who was fantastic, but I only had like 2 guitar books and I had like 3 albums or something like that. But these days, like any direction you want to go musically, you can find either inspiration very easily and for very cheaply as well, or you can find someone that specializes in that. So I think, as you say, there is a double-edged sword there, as you mentioned earlier, with the whole people just getting very scattered in their learning and sort of like just skimming over material rather than having the discipline, that sort of martial arts style discipline, to really dive in deep and to explore something in detail. But I think if you use it well, then this is potentially one of the most leveraged times in history to study things like music.
I couldn't agree more, and I echo your sentiment about going deep, not wide. You know, don't do a survey. You know, focus is really, really important, and that it's all there. You know, 100 times over. You know, everything you could ever want and more. But that points back to the value of, I think, having a good teacher, having a human teacher. Having the connectivity really with someone that can help, at least like I mentioned before, put you on that raft before you get pushed out to sea, and then you can discover whatever you want to discover. But because um, yeah, there is a factor of, you know, I've seen it in GIT students where they come in and they've learned off of YouTube, and so they have a very sort of hyphenated skill set that they're really good at certain things, but there's no context to it at all. You know, they don't know how to function in a band, or they don't really, you know, there's a lot of pieces that they're missing. So it is a very interesting sort of, you know, siloed approach in certain cases, but you really do still need to have someone great to study with. And I think, you know, if you live somewhere very far away, there are certainly online resources like what you're doing, or, you know, I'm a fan of True Fire. I think they're very diverse and they have a lot of great content, and you know, do that very well. That's one of the things on my desk. It's like I've had for a while, like to do some courses for them. I have a book project that's sitting here as well for me to get at. And I take these things very seriously because of that impact in the world. You know, I don't want to do it kind of halfway. I really want to do my very best. So that's probably something I'm going to look at in the beginning of next year as far as projects and so forth. But I do appreciate the work that you guys do. You have a very large following, and so I hope a couple of the words, you know, that we've shared, you know, make some kind of difference, and ultimately just encourage people out there to get in the game. Don't be afraid. You know, just be a part of a community if you can, and if you're not, you know, a community of one is great too. I mean, a lot of, you know, our icons started, they were just by themselves. You know, maybe they had a record that they wore out. There's no one, you know, codified way that this is the way to become a jazz guitar player. There's 1,000 ways to become a jazz guitar player, but ultimately, you know, it's the people that you meet, the people you play with, the community that you get to be a part of, this family, for lack of a better word, that's pretty extraordinary. You know, it is probably one of the best parts. When I travel, I was just in New York and meeting so many guitar players there, or, you know, wherever I go. there's just sort of this brotherhood and sisterhood that's amazing, and anyone from any part of the world. And so I really appreciate the resources that you guys provide, and there's room for more. There's Fret Dojo 1, 2, 3, 4, 1,000. There's like a lot of dojos are needed, and I think that's the beautiful part of all of it, is there's room for everyone, and every single version of jazz guitar player that's out there works. It works, so that we don't have to compare ourselves at all. I mean, that's that waste of time thing. I think it's really wonderful to see some of your guests like Barry Green or Cheryl Bailey or Jimmy Bruno. They're all incredibly talented, great players, but absolutely found their own ways to, build up their voice and how they express it. And that's where it really becomes like a gem, when someone's willing to carry it through all the way, and really evolve to that high level. It's very inspiring. So I hope I can just encourage someone out there, to keep going, because that's, the very simple thing is just don't quit. Just never quit. Never quit. And you'll get there. And it's that simple. All the rest of it, just enjoy yourself along the way. And I often see Wes Montgomery and all of his joy and, what he embodied and the way that he played, what a wonderful example. There's a lot of great examples. There's so many people inspiring out there. So, I hope I can someday, like I do in airports sometimes, meet one of your Fret Dojo people out in the world, out in the wild. It's funny. I get people tapping me. But let be in Japan, and so it's like, oh, Bethsan, hi, I was, I got your book, or I was your student, and nothing delights me more. It's really a fantastic thing. So anyway, future of the guitar, yeah, it's the world. I hope so. Jazz guitar, I should say, not the guitar.
Thank you, Beth, and for all of you Fret Dojo fans out there, make sure you wear your t-shirts out and about, so that I know you're a Fret Dojo fan when I come and see you. But it's been absolutely wonderful today, Beth. It's been really amazing hearing your words of wisdom on the guitar. It's such a privilege to have someone that's had such a long history of performance, but also teaching. Tell us before we wrap up, where do you regularly perform in the States? Where can people kind of sit in and listen to your amazing playing?
Oh, thank you. It's so funny. I this year seem to have played more outside of where I live, outside of town, than in LA. Like, it's sort of a running joke that I never play in LA. I live in LA. So I mean, I've been all over the place this last year. I think for the rest of this year, it's kind of, chilling out. And then I have stuff in the works for possibly going to Italy next year, and in the Pacific Northwest near Seattle, and a few other things that are getting settled that I can't really talk about. So again, not in LA. So I guess if we talk about being diligent, I should probably fix that little pothole in my playing and do some local gigs. But yeah, I get great invitations to like go out and, play interesting places. So stay tuned is probably what I'd say. I'm on social media. You can find me pretty easily. I'll put stuff out there, little private things here and there, little quiet gigs. But yeah, I got to play more out in LA and be findable, as they say, searchable. Google me. But yeah, stay tuned next year, because I do have some really great things coming up for sure. I'm excited.
All right, so it's been a wonderful session with Beth Marlis today. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on the show today, Beth. So you can find Beth at BethMarlis.com online or on socials. And yeah, we'd love to have you back again on the show.
Great. You guys, thanks so much for having me here. It's been a blast. Great meeting you, and thanks for doing this.
And for more jazz guitar lessons, tips, and free stuff, visit www.FretDojo.com.